It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Well, welcome to a new year, and as 2024 closed out, I covered the final Universal classic monster films, at least based on what most folks would agree would be the true set of Universal classic monsters in terms of their cycle. But there are still two adjunct films from that series to cover that I will be covering later this year. But as we start the new year, we are really truly ending an era as it pertains to a key piece of the history of Monster Mondays. This month, I'll be looking at the final four Showa-era Godzilla films. In fact, it's the final four Godzilla films produced to date that need to be covered here on Monster Mondays. And it begins with 1969's kind of batshit crazy All Monsters Attack. It's kind of perfect that the four films left to cover of the Godzilla films to date are being covered over these four Mondays in January 2025. These four remaining Godzilla films are the most pointed at as being truly the bizarre and wild films in the entire catalog. But let's start with All Monsters Attack. This is also known by the title Godzilla's Revenge. But what's curious about it is that Godzilla is an even more reduced role than normal. Oh, sure, Godzilla is the marquee player, but he's usually spared for the final act of the movie or, to really kind of get audiences juiced and energized about the big climax. It's not like he spends more than maybe 20% of screen time in any one film, but in this movie, it's Minya, his son, that has the most screen time. And this is really Minya's movie. But it's not like this movie was actually even expected to happen. The year before, 1968's Destroy All Monsters was intended to be the final Toho Godzilla film. Instead, Toho wanted Filmation to work with them on an animated series to begin airing for the 1969-1970 American television season. But Filmation was the company that was behind the Star Trek animated series in the mid-70s and the He-Man and the She-Ra series in the 80s. But the deal with Toho fell through, but the spirit behind it animated Toho in a different way. They sought to turn Godzilla into a true children's property. While most of the 60s era of Godzilla's run were pretty universally loved by kids and teens, and some adults, even to this day, a lot of adults. But Toho really wanted Godzilla to be as kid-friendly as maybe, say, Gamera was. So, exit Filmation, and in came a very quick change of gears. Toho opted to turn around a super quick, fairly cheap, and intently child-friendly Godzilla film for 1969. All Monsters Attack moved away from science fiction and giant monster horror of the movies of the past in favor of children's fantasy. And don't worry about continuity after the supposed final film that found all the monsters living happily on Monster Island. Destroy All Monsters took place in 1999. All Monsters Attack takes place 30 years earlier in the present day of 1969. So in order to turn the film out quickly, Ishiro Honda, making his next to last Godzilla-centric film, came in, shot the movie's main plot, and utilized stock footage from Ebirah Horror of the Deep, Son of Godzilla, King Kong Escapes, and Destroy All Monsters to fill out the film. And by filling the movie with all that stock footage already owned by Toho, the film was made extremely cheaply, and Toho still got something released in 1969 despite the Filmation plan falling through. Filming began in October 1969, and it was finished in time for a Christmas release 2 months later. Now, All Monsters Attack tends to have a very infamous reputation. Most people consider this the worst of all the Godzilla films. It's overly kid-friendly. It's a clip show. It features a kid who is kind of insane, almost to the point of annoying at times. Minya talks to the kid. However, some people think it might just be one of the more interesting films in the series, at least in that era. So let's get into it and talk about what All Monsters Attack is really all about. Now, this short little ditty, for real, it's only a 70-minute movie, making it pretty much the shortest of all Godzilla films, I believe, begins by introducing us to young Ichiro Miki. He lives in Kawasaki, an industrial town that clearly serves as one of the inspirations for next week's movie that we'll talk about in this series. But Ichiro is a latchkey kid who doesn't have many friends. Part of this is that he's overly imaginative. He tells his only friend of his same age, a girl named Sachiko, that he's met Godzilla's son, Minya, and he proves it by saying he knows the sound that the young kaiju makes. Now, Ichiro finds a piece of an industrial machine that gets stolen by his bullies, who claim that he found it in their territory and not where he and Sachiko actually did find it. Now, when it comes to adults, Ichiro has an old man toy maker named Shinpei, who is a friend of his. And Shinpei gladly shows off his toys and talks to Ichiro about his interests, specifically kaiju. But he even tries to provide Ichiro advice on dealing with bullies, and one in particular that Ichiro calls Gabara. However, Shinpei also has some serious concerns for the young boy's constant retreat into his monster interest and his own imagination. Now, after meeting Ichiro, we do see that his father, Kenichi, he's sitting down on a break talking to a coworker, and there's a newspaper article about a heist in which millions of yen were stolen. And that's a subplot that runs under the main plot of this movie for the entire runtime, and it does intersect with Ichiro later. But Ichiro gets home, and he even sees a TV report about the police looking for the perps in that heist. But when the TV loses reception, Ichiro decides to go to his cardboard computer and asks for it to send him to Monster Island to see his monster friends by way of, you guessed it, a commercial airliner. What, you didn't guess that? But seriously, his imagination doesn't just transport him to Monster Island. No, he has to go there like anyone else on vacation or doing business, by airplane. You gotta love Ichiro's sense of practicality in these matters. But on Monster Island, Ichiro sees Godzilla taking on the mantis monsters Kamacuras, as well as what we said, that was the monster that we saw as the audience and son of Godzilla. But after Godzilla roasts some Kamacuras, Ichiro then sees some of the other inhabitants of the island, Gorosaurus, Anguirus, Manda, and that giant condor that was never really given a name, I don't think. But Ichiro ends up falling down a hole, but gets lifted up by rope by Minya. Now there, Ichiro converses with Minya, but they eventually get chased away by a monster Minya calls Gabara. And they talk about how they both have a bully in their lives named Gabara, and soon Ichiro is awoken by Shinpei, who is asked to go tell Ichiro that not only will his father be working late, but his mother won't be home tonight either, leaving Ichiro basically all alone. Now, Shinpei does offer to dine with Ichiro tonight, and he invites him over to his apartment for dinner. But first, Ichiro decides to go out and play first, but he almost runs into his bullies, so he runs away from them and into an abandoned building. But inside there, we also see the criminals using the building to hide out. And they watch and end up following Ichiro to find out where he lives. And that night, Ichiro goes back to sleep and dreams himself into Monster Island once again. And he finds Minya, who tells Ichiro that he also has no friends. And it should be noted that the original Japanese language version of this movie, Minya has a woman's voice, and it sounds like she's speaking through a drive-through speaker at a restaurant. In the American dubbed version, Minya has a doofy-sounding guy voice and speaks kind of at the same quality and sound as Ichiro's dubbing. It's kind of a nice little way to tip the hat at this being clearly an imagined conversation between Ichiro and Minya. But Ichiro and Minya watch Godzilla battle Ebra and Kumonga, and when Minya tries to help in the fight against the giant spider Kumonga, his smoke rings are ineffective, and Minya tells Ichiro that even Godzilla struggled at first and had to practice and had to get stronger and had to be better at what he was to become what he is. And after the defeat of the spider, Gabra returns to menace the two friendless kids, and Minya doesn't want to run this time because he's afraid Godzilla will think he's a coward. So he tries fighting off Gabra, but the smoke rings are ineffective and only makes Gabra laugh at him, and eventually knocking over the kid, walking off laughing at the kid, the monster ultimately bullied. But Godzilla then orders Minya to come practice his fire breathing, but Ichiro is eventually ripped from his dream by the thieves. Now, the reason why the thieves want Ichiro and take him hostage is that Ichiro discovered one of the guy's license in the abandoned building. Now, thinking the kid will give that to the cops, they take him hostage. However, what Ichiro actually wanted to do with the license that he found was to obtain a car. No kidding. He wanted to use the license to buy a car and drive it around town. But anyway, while he's being held hostage, he forces himself back into the dream world and he watches Minya fight Gabra, even getting off some real atomic breath shots at the doofy bully. Now, when Godzilla arrives, he basically tells Minya to fight his own battles and forces the kid back into the fight where he's quickly overpowered and embarrassed by the bully until Godzilla has to intervene himself so Minya can get away from Gabra's electricity-based attack. However, Godzilla is forced to fight Gabra more directly after Minya uses a bit of ingenuity thanks to a suggestion from Ichiro to defeat the monster. And angry, Gabra attacks Godzilla like a dumbass and gets thoroughly routed by the king of the monsters. So in the end, what does Ichiro learn from these imaginary trips to Monster Island? Well, first, he's got to fight for himself and stand up to bullies in the real world. This starts with the thieves. He frees himself and fights for freedom away from the thieves by using some of the tactics that Minya used against Gabra, which includes biting, hiding, and setting booby traps for the bad guys. He even pictures Gabra when approached by one of the thieves who is brandishing a knife. When he sprays the bad guy with a fire extinguisher, he pictures himself as Minya firing off his atomic breath. And eventually, the thieves are arrested by the police. And the next day, Ichiro runs into his own Gabra bully who wants Ichiro to join his group. But Ichiro says no, calls him a bully, and defends himself in a fight, winning the friends over after he ends up running off and causing a guy painting a billboard to fall off and spill the paint all over himself, which, because Ichiro was messing with the guy's motorcycle, I don't know, that kind of sounds like Ichiro kind of bullied that guy just trying to do his job by messing with the motorcycle's horn, which causes the guy to turn to Ichiro, tell him to stop, which causes him to lose his balance and fall off the thing and spill the paint all over himself. But whatever. I guess Ichiro now has a bunch of friends who were also bullies and probably will still be bullies. Whatever. What do I know? What I do know is that I do want to talk about the point of this episode of Monster Mondays, where I talk about the 3 things that I like about the movie. First, look. This movie is kind of an inside joke among the Godzilla fandom. It's the one movie that I personally do say is pretty much the one that you can very easily skip over and never really watch. This is the last time that Minya shows up in a Godzilla movie until we see the more serious and advanced Godzilla Jr. in the Heisei era. It's the only time Gabra ever showed up in the Godzilla universe. It's hard to really say exactly how crazy this movie is without you actually seeing it. But trust me, it's batshit insane. It was released in America as Godzilla's Revenge, and I am not sure whatsoever what that title is supposed to mean, because Godzilla isn't getting revenge on anything or anyone. It's a hard movie to truly convey how crazy it is, because it's simultaneously completely different than any movie in the series before it. And it's also exactly what people who aren't Godzilla fans think what these movies are in the series. It's a movie that was made because Toho wanted something to get released in 1969, while Destroy All Monsters was still something of a hit for them. So it is kind of a cash grab, but you know what? It's not truly as bad as people might make it out to be. Sure, I do say it's the one you can skip over, but the worst thing you can say about it is that it's a clip show. The second thing you can say maybe negatively about it is that it leans so damn hard on the kid side of things, to the point that Godzilla isn't really even at all needed for this movie. But you know what? At least it's short. So yes, I'm giving a like for this movie being only 70 minutes long. I mean, if it's going to be a clip show cash grab, at least it's short. It's a movie you skip, or you can skip rather, but if you do watch it as you go through the Godzilla library, at least it's only just over an hour, and we still get monster action all over the place. And frankly, it's maybe the highest ratio monster to person in terms of screen time in the entire series. However, the monster business does wrap up at about 15 minutes to the end, which also makes it a different beast when it comes to how long this movie continues after the cinematic climactic monster battle. Which leads me to second. This movie is a fine movie for kids to watch, because at the end of the day, it isn't really about the monsters. No, it's about Ichiro. The monsters are there for decoration to keep young kids' eyes glued to the movie, but I do really like the message the movie is trying to convey. People need to learn to fight their own battles. And this doesn't necessarily mean it's teaching you to throw a punch at your bully or your enemy, but what it's teaching is to stand up for yourself. Whether that is standing up for yourself if you get pushed around, or standing up for what you believe is right. This is about confronting bullies, and I think it does a good job at presenting that in a way that uses the monsters as allegory. It's very clear Ichiro struggles connecting with friends and his own parents. His parents work at night, leaving him home alone most of the time. It almost has, something to say about structures in society that force both parents to work and be away from their kids. I mean, I get the impression that Ichiro spends a lot of nights and a lot of days not seeing his parents. He has to basically care for himself. But anyway, sure, Ichiro is kind of a drip, but you do kind of sympathize with him in that way. What else is he supposed to do but dream up his own friends and his own life lessons? This movie really does have deeper things to say, while encasing it in this kind of very silly plot where a kid goes to talk to Godzilla's son about bullies. And let's talk about Minya's bully too. Now, if the movie itself is an inside joke among the Godzilla fandom, you better believe Gabara is too. Gabara is almost designed to be made fun of, and I love it. Ever since movies were regularly released in color, anytime you see a movie about kid bullies in America, it's almost like you have to have that bully be a redhead. I'm being serious. Maybe it's the era in which I grew up in, but when I'm told to think up of a bully, to picture a bully in my head, I usually think of him being mean looking and redheaded. I think it's Christmas Story that probably seared that into my head. But Gabara has hair that is more or less designed to make him look like a ginger. It's crazy because I can look at Gabara and immediately identify him with picking on kids smaller than he is and then laughing about it. It's because that's what he does. I mean, the work in designing Gabara is perfect because he's ugly, like most bullies are portrayed as being. He's got plenty of things to be insecure about that would lead him to picking on children, as many bullies are portrayed as having. And damn it, if they didn't give him tufts of reddish blonde hair like most bullies of a certain era were portrayed as looking. It's when this dipshit decides to pick a fight with Godzilla, you have to be pleased with how easily Godzilla puts him in his place. And it's great design work to create a bully for this movie. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. And you can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we get into the psychedelic with Godzilla vs. Hedorah, also known as Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. Until next week, stay spooky.